History isn't just about facts, it's about who gets to tell the story. Over time, rumors become legends, legends become textbooks, and uncomfortable truths get buried under patriotic slogans or Hollywood scripts. Let's shatter 10 of the most persistent historical myths, including the ones they don't want you to question. Number 1. Napoleon was insecure because he was short? Not even close. The image of Napoleon as a tiny, angry man trying to compensate for his height is one of the most widely accepted historical myths and one of the most inaccurate. Napoleon Bonaparte stood around 5 feet 7 inches, roughly 170 centimeters, which was actually average or even slightly above average for a Frenchman in the 18th century. The confusion comes from British propaganda during the Napoleonic Wars, which mocked him relentlessly and deliberately mistranslated French units of measurement. In French feet, he was listed as 5 feet 2 inches, but this converts to about 5 feet 7 inches in modern terms. The Napoleon complex idea was a posthumous invention, more psychology than fact, and says more about how we villainize power than about the man himself. Do we still spread this myth because it's easier to mock a tyrant than understand him? Number 2. George Washington had wooden teeth? No, they were made from slaves. One of the most beloved myths about the father of America is that he wore charmingly crude wooden dentures. It's false and far darker than people realize. Washington did lose most of his teeth in early adulthood, but his dentures were made from a mix of ivory, gold, lead, cow teeth, and even human teeth taken from enslaved people. Records from Mount Vernon show that Washington purchased teeth from the enslaved, most likely under coercion. The myth of wooden teeth was a way to sanitize the disturbing truth. Some dentures even had springs and screws that distorted his face when he wore them, making his portraits inaccurate. The real story is a window into the hypocrisy of America's founding, a man who championed liberty while quite literally speaking through the mouths of the enslaved. If this truth was widely known, would schoolchildren still celebrate him the same way? Number 3. The Pilgrims came for religious freedom, but denied it to others. We're taught that the Mayflower Pilgrims fled persecution in England to build a land of tolerance and freedom. But once they arrived, they built a theocratic society where dissent was punished, heretics were exiled, and even celebrating Christmas was banned. The Puritans left England not to promote religious liberty, but to enforce their own version of religious conformity. Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, was banished from Massachusetts for believing in separation of church and state. And Hutchinson was exiled for holding prayer meetings. Pilgrims didn't even call themselves pilgrims, the term came much later. The Thanksgiving narrative we're given is a sanitized fable. Is it time we stop treating the Pilgrims as freedom-loving heroes and start seeing them as fundamentalists? Number 4. The U.S. Civil War wasn't really about slavery? Yes, it was. This myth refuses to die, especially in certain U.S. states. But the primary documents don't lie. The Confederate States' own declarations of secession mention slavery explicitly. Mississippi's declaration reads, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Southern leaders argued for the natural inferiority of black people and their economic dependence on unpaid labor. The myth that the war was about states' rights is a 20th century invention, especially promoted during the Jim Crow era, designed to reframe the Confederacy as noble rebels instead of defenders of human bondage. Even Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens declared that slavery was the cornerstone of their new government. Number 5. Abraham Lincoln freed all the slaves? Not exactly. While Lincoln is rightly remembered for the Emancipation Proclamation, it's often misunderstood. That 1863 document only freed slaves in Confederate-held territories, where the U.S. government had no control. Slaves in border states like Kentucky or Maryland, which remained loyal to the Union, were not freed until much later. Lincoln himself was cautious and politically strategic. In fact, early in the war he supported colonization, a plan to resettle freed black Americans in Central America or Africa. Only after immense pressure from abolitionists and military necessity did Lincoln move toward full emancipation. The 13th Amendment, which truly ended slavery, wasn't passed until 1865, and even then, slavery persisted through prison labor loopholes. Number 6. Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity with a kite? It's a PR story. The tale of Franklin flying a kite in a thunderstorm to discover electricity is a staple of American folklore, but extremely unlikely. While Franklin did write about electricity and performed many experiments, there's no solid evidence he actually flew the kite himself during a storm. The story first appeared 15 years later, written by Franklin's friend Joseph Priestley. In reality, performing such an experiment would have almost certainly killed him. Others who tried similar experiments were electrocuted. Historians believe Franklin may have proposed the idea theoretically but didn't risk it himself. The story endured because it painted him as a daring genius, a brand that served the early republic well. Number 7. The U.S. Constitution was written for everyone? Not even close. The U.S. Constitution is often praised as a beacon of liberty, but it was crafted for a very narrow group: white, landowning men. Women couldn't vote. Enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation, but had no rights. Native Americans were entirely excluded. The Electoral College was partly designed to placate slaveholding states. The document included no guarantee of universal suffrage. In fact, it took dozens of amendments and over 200 years to move toward full civil rights. Even today, key flaws in its design, like unequal representation in the Senate, persist. The idea that it was a perfect document from the start is more myth than reality. Number 8. Paul Revere rode alone, shouting "The British are coming"? Not quite. The famous midnight ride of Paul Revere has been immortalized in American memory, but the reality is far more complex. First, Revere wasn't alone, he was one of several riders, including William Dawes and Samuel Prescott. Second, he never shouted "The British are coming," because most people in Massachusetts still considered themselves British. He likely said something like, "The regulars are out." Third, Revere was actually captured by British soldiers and didn't complete the ride. It was Prescott who made it to Concord. The myth was popularized much later by poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who reshaped the tale for patriotic effect. Number 9. The Wild West was constantly violent and lawless? It was mostly PR. We've been sold a vision of the Wild West filled with daily gunfights, outlaw duels, and lawlessness. In reality, towns like Dodge City and Tombstone had lower homicide rates than many eastern cities of the time. Most gun control laws in American history were stricter in the West, where towns often banned carrying firearms inside city limits. Many legendary outlaws, like Billy the Kid or Jesse James, were more myth than menace, their stories blown out of proportion by dime novels and newspapers hungry for sensationalism. The Wild West myth helped fuel Manifest Destiny, painting expansion as a righteous struggle against chaos, rather than the organized displacement of native peoples. Number 10. The Founding Fathers were united patriots? They hated each other. We like to imagine the Founding Fathers as a band of noble brothers fighting for liberty, but they were often bitter enemies. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson despised one another. John Adams referred to Hamilton as the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. Jefferson funded newspapers that accused Washington of acting like a king. Hamilton was killed in a duel with Aaron Burr, the sitting vice president. The early republic was rife with smears, bribes, and backroom deals. Political parties quickly emerged despite Washington's warnings, and some founders actively plotted against each other's presidencies. The myth of unity serves national cohesion, but the truth is far messier and more human.